Have you ever wondered why God allowed you to occupy a certain place, position, or circumstance in your life? Could it be possible that what today seems like coincidence is actually part of a greater plan that He designed from eternity? Esther was a young orphan and foreigner. She never imagined she would become queen in the most powerful empire of her time. However, at the most critical moment for her people, she understood that she was not there by chance, but because God had strategically placed her to fulfill a purpose. In chapter 7, we see how the courage of a woman at the precise instant changed the destiny of an entire nation. What seemed like just another banquet became the stage where the enemy was unmasked. The justice of God was manifested, and the salvation of the people began to be fulfilled. And here arises the great question for us. What if you too have come to the place where you are, not for your comfort, but because God wants to use you in this time for something greater? Esther 7:1-2 says, So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And on the second day, while they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it shall be given to you. The chapter opens with an apparently ordinary atmosphere, a royal banquet. King Ahasuerus and Haman, his prime minister, sit at Esther's table. What for them was a moment of pleasure and feasting, for Esther was the stage where the destiny of her people would be decided. The king, in the middle of the celebration, insists for the second time on knowing what the true petition of his queen is. His disposition is generous. He offers to grant her anything she asks, even up to half of the kingdom. This detail reflects not only the special favor she had before the king, but also how God was inclining the heart of Ahasuerus to open the door to the plea of his servant. Behind this scene, one perceives a spiritual tension. Esther had fasted and prayed together with her people for 3 days, and now she was at the exact moment when that intention had to become action. God had prepared each step, the king willing to listen, Haman present in the room, and Esther with the opportunity to speak. None of this was coincidence. Everything was aligned with the perfect timing of the Lord. This beginning teaches us something powerful. What seems like a simple, everyday moment can actually be a stage designed by God to reveal His plan. The banquet was more than a social event. It was an altar where divine justice would manifest. Likewise, we learn that the grace of God not only opens doors, but also keeps those doors open until the moment comes to act. Esther did not rush things at the first banquet. She waited for God's direction, and now, at the second, the hour of truth had come. In our lives, this reminds us that we must be attentive to banquets that seem normal, but are actually divine settings prepared to fulfill His purpose. God can use a common environment, a simple conversation, or an unexpected opportunity to do something extraordinary. Esther 7:3-4 says, "Then Queen Esther answered and said, O King, if I have found favor in your sight, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. If we had been sold merely as male and female slaves, I would have held my peace, but our destruction would bring irreparable harm to the king." After days of fasting, prayer, and waiting, Esther finally opens her heart. Her first word is not to speak about herself or personal benefits, but about grace. "If I have found favor in your sight," her petition is born from humility and respect, not demand. The queen understood that although she was the wife of the king, true influence came from the favor of God upon her life. Her plea is direct and moving. She asks for her life and the life of her people. With one sentence, Esther publicly identifies herself with the Jews. Until this moment, her origin had remained secret, but now the time of God arrived, and she revealed who she was and to whom she belonged. This act is not only one of courage, but also of surrender. She risks her own safety to save her people. Esther exposes the decree of death clearly. We have been sold to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. She describes the triple danger her people face: total destruction, physical annihilation, and cultural extermination. But she also adds a strategic reflection. If they had only been sold as slaves, she would have remained silent, for she did not want to trouble the king unnecessarily. However, the seriousness of the matter was such that it even affected the throne itself. The loss of an entire people would bring irreparable damage to the kingdom. Here we see how God gave Esther not only courage, but wisdom to present her petition. Her plea combines humility, bravery, and clarity, three elements that make her intention a powerful weapon. This passage teaches us that there are moments when silence is wise, as she did before, but there are also moments when speaking is necessary and decisive. Esther knew how to discern when she should risk and raise her voice. Her example reminds us that God places His children in strategic positions, not to remain silent, but to speak when it is most needed. The lesson is clear. When the time comes to intercede, we must do so with humility, but also with courage. Our voice can be the instrument God uses to bring deliverance, justice, and salvation. Esther 7:5-6 says, "Then King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, Who is he, and where is he, who has presumed in his heart to do so. Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. The response of Esther produces an immediate reaction in the king. Up to this point, Ahasuerus did not know that the decree of extermination directly affected his own queen. The heart of the monarch ignites with indignation. Who would dare to plot such evil against the life of the queen and her people? The question is not merely curiosity, but astonishment and contained fury. Esther, with courage, points without hesitation to the culprit. The enemy and adversary is this wicked Haman. Her words are forceful. She does not accuse him in secret nor with insinuations, but unmasks him publicly in the very banquet where he expected to be honored. What Haman had planned in the shadows is revealed in broad daylight. This moment is key in the entire narrative. Esther, who until now had remained silent about her identity and about Haman's plans, now stands with firmness to expose the truth. She does not do it in her own name, but in representation of her people. Her bravery dismantles the work of the enemy and places Haman in the position of the defeated. The text says that Haman was terrified before the king and queen, the man who not long ago boasted of his power, who had ordered the gallows for Mordecai, and who intended to exterminate the Jews, now trembles in the presence of a humble woman who found favor before God. Here is fulfilled what Proverbs 16:18 says, "Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall." The spiritual lesson is clear. The enemy may raise plans against the people of God, but the moment will come when he will be exposed. The truth proclaimed in God's timing exposes the lie and destroys the plans of the wicked. In our lives, this passage reminds us not to fear when the enemy seems strong. If we remain in the grace and purpose of God, He will give us the courage to speak truth and to see the ruin of those who seek our harm. The voice of one obedient woman was enough to bring down the most powerful adversary of the kingdom, for behind her was the hand of the God who fights for his people. Esther 7:7 says, "And the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood to plead for his life to Queen Esther. For he saw that evil was determined against him by the king." The banquet suddenly changes tone. What began with wine and celebration ends in fury and tension. King Ahasuerus, upon hearing the direct accusation against Haman, rose in burning anger and went out to the palace garden. This gesture reveals an inner conflict. On one hand, respect for the queen and indignation over the decree of death. On the other, the betrayal of a man in whom he had placed his trust. As the king leaves to process his rage, Haman is left exposed. For the first time, the powerful minister who once forced everyone to bow before him now pleads for his life. The text emphasizes that he recognized that evil had already been decided against him. There was no escape. The man who had built the gallows for Mordecai now faces the imminence of his own judgment. Here, an eternal principle is fulfilled. The pride of the wicked always ends in humiliation. Haman, who sought to destroy an entire people, now desperately begs before a Jewish woman whom days earlier he had considered insignificant. God reverses positions. The oppressor becomes the supplicant, and the victim becomes the instrument of justice. This passage also reveals the spiritual weight of decisive moments. The king, the highest human authority, withdraws in confusion. The sentence against Haman was sealed. It was not merely the wrath of Ahasuerus that condemned him, but the justice of heaven that had heard the cry of a people in fasting and prayer. The lesson is clear. When God rises on behalf of his children, the enemy loses all his strength. Even if he seems powerful and untouchable, the day will come when he will be on his knees, begging for what he once denied others. In our lives, this passage reminds us that we must not fear the apparent triumph of the unjust. Their plans may prosper for a time, but the justice of God is inevitable. Haman thought he controlled the kingdom, but in an instant he was reduced to supplication and shame. Thus works God. He changes the scene in a single moment, humbling the proud and exalting those who trust in him. Esther 7-8 is narrated. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet, Haman had fallen on the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, "Will he even assault the queen while I am in the house?" As soon as the king uttered this word, they covered Haman's face. The scene turns even more dramatic. The king returns from the garden with his anger still burning, and what he finds is Haman fallen upon the couch where Esther was. Although his intention was to plead for his life, the situation is interpreted as a greater offense and attempt to violate the queen in the king's presence. This detail reveals the perfection of God's timing. While Haman tried to defend himself, every movement turned against him. Divine providence placed Haman in the worst possible position, leaving him without justification. What was meant as a plea became his final condemnation. The king's order to cover Haman's face marks a point of no return. In Persian culture, covering the face of the accused meant that he would no longer be heard nor have hope of pardon. It was the end of royal favor, the sign that he was destined for execution. Spiritually, this passage reminds us that the enemy always falls into his own traps. Haman, who had manipulated laws, built gallows, and devised strategies to destroy the Jews, now finds himself trapped in a situation beyond his control. God's sovereignty demonstrates that no human plan, however powerful it may seem, can prevail against divine purpose. The practical lesson for us is clear. When we trust in the Lord, we do not need to fight in our own strength. God knows how to move the pieces on the board so that the adversaries of His people are exposed and defeated at the right moment. What appears to be coincidence is actually the justice of God executed with precision. Haman, who seemed untouchable, ended covered in shame, without the right to defend himself. Esther, who seemed weak, stood firm under God's grace. Here, the great contrast is revealed. Pride leads to downfall, but humility and obedience open the way to victory. Esther 7-9 is narrated. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs serving the king, said, "Behold, the gallows that Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good for the king, stands in Haman's house, 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on it." In the midst of the tension of the banquet, a secondary yet decisive character appears, Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs. His intervention was no coincidence. At the precise moment, he brings to the king's memory the existence of the gallows that Haman had built for Mordecai. With his words, he reveals the irony of divine justice. The same instrument of death prepared for the righteous becomes the sentence of the wicked. The contrast is striking. Mordecai, the man who had saved the king's life by exposing a plot, had been condemned by Haman to die on that very gallows. But now, before the king, the truth comes to light. The one who sought to destroy is revealed as the true enemy, and the one who was to be executed is vindicated by God. The detail of the gallows' height, 50 cubits, about 22 meters, emphasizes Haman's arrogance. He intended Mordecai's execution to be a public spectacle of humiliation, but instead prepared his own ruin. Thus, the biblical principle of Proverbs is fulfilled. He who digs a pit will fall into it, and he who rolls a stone, it will return upon him. The king's decision is swift and final. Hang him on it. No lengthy trial. No possible defense. The king's word becomes the seal of justice, and Haman receives upon himself the sentence he had plotted against another. Spiritually, this passage teaches us that God is a righteous judge who does not overlook evil. The enemies may seem to prosper for a time, but sooner or later, the justice of God is revealed. Haman represents the pride that rises against the people of God, but Harbona, though seemingly insignificant, becomes the instrument that exposes the truth at the appointed time. This reminds us that God can use even unexpected people to accomplish His purposes. The voice of a eunuch was enough to carry out the sentence that would change the destiny of the empire. Indeed, the Lord teaches us that no righteous word falls to the ground when He uses it to manifest His justice. Esther 7:10 is narrated, "So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's wrath subsided." The story reaches its climax with an ironic and powerful twist. Haman is hanged on the very gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. The instrument of death he had raised as a symbol of power and pride becomes the monument of his shame and defeat. Here, the justice of God is revealed in full clarity. The enemy reaps exactly what he has sown. Haman had sown hatred, intrigue, and violence. He reaps condemnation, humiliation, and death. His pride led him to prepare a public punishment for the righteous, but heaven reversed the plot. The righteous was preserved, and the wicked was destroyed. The text adds a meaningful detail, and the king's wrath subsided. Haman's execution was not only an act of justice, but also one of peace. The conflict burning in the king's heart, his rage upon discovering the betrayal, was calmed once the guilty received his sentence. This reflects a spiritual principle. The justice of God brings rest, because when He intervenes, He restores the order that sin had disrupted. This ending also shows that victory does not depend on human weapons, but on divine intervention. Esther and Mordecai raised no armies, tore down no walls, nor manipulated political power. They simply remained obedient, prayerful, and faithful. And God, in His perfect timing, overturned the enemy's plans. In our own lives, this passage reminds us that we should not fear the traps set by those who wish us harm. If we remain in the will of God, those very traps will turn against those who built them. The justice of the Lord may seem delayed, but it always arrives at the perfect time. The end of Haman leaves us with an eternal lesson. The pride of man will never prevail against the plans of God. The throne of grace will always have the final word. And those who trust in the Lord will see victory even in the darkest of times. And who knows if for such a time as this you have come to the kingdom. Chapter 7 closes with the fall of Haman, but in reality it opens a greater horizon, the confirmation that God had placed Esther on the throne for that time. What seemed like a simple detail of life, the rise of an orphaned young woman to become Queen of Persia, turned out to be the key to preserving the existence of an entire people. Divine justice was not only manifested in the gallows where Haman was hanged, but also revealed in how God used the obedience, courage, and grace of a woman to change the destiny of an entire nation. Esther was not queen by chance, nor to enjoy privilege. She was placed in that position with an eternal purpose. The contrast is clear. Haman used his position to oppress and was destroyed. Esther used hers to intercede and became an instrument of salvation. Mordecai remained faithful and was soon honored. This chapter reminds us that history is not ruled by luck, nor by the evil of men, but by the sovereignty of God. Every detail, from the banquets to Harbonah's words, was part of a perfect design that culminated in the deliverance of the Jews. The lesson for us today is clear. You are not where you are by accident. God has placed you in your family, your job, your city, and your circumstances for a purpose. You may not understand everything now, but the time will come when you'll see that your position was strategic to fulfill a greater plan. We are also called to act with courage and to intercede when the moment requires it. Perhaps your voice is the one God wants to use to save, restore, or build others. Maybe your life, your testimony, or even your silent prayer is the key that unlocks change in those around you. Esther, chapter 7, leaves us this great truth. The justice of God is fulfilled. The plans of the enemy are undone, and those who trust in the Lord are raised up to be instruments in His work. The story of Esther 7 is not merely the tale of a royal banquet or the fall of a powerful man. It is the revelation of how God works in silence, weaving every detail together until His purposes are fulfilled with perfect precision. From the beginning of the chapter, the atmosphere seems festive wine, banquet, and royal company. However, beneath that ordinary appearance, one of the most decisive spiritual battles for the people of God is unfolding. The king's question to Esther opens the door to the fulfillment of the eternal purpose. It was the exact moment when prayer, fasting, and preparation would unite with the brave action of an obedient woman. When Esther pleaded for her life and the life of her people, she revealed herself not only as queen, but as intercessor. In her voice resounded the cry of an entire nation. Her words were humble, yet full of power, because they came from faith and personal sacrifice. She was willing to lose everything, even the crown, to save her people. The exposure of Haman as the enemy reveals an eternal truth. Sooner or later, the adversary of God's people is unmasked. Haman, who had planned the destruction of the Jews with cunning and pride, was reduced to trembling and shame before the king and the queen. Pride always precedes the fall. The king, filled with anger, leaves the banquet. This pause is not a coincidence. It reflects the process by which God's justice is revealed at the right time. While Ahasuerus wrestles between anger and decision, Haman falls into despair and begs for his life. But in that moment, every movement he makes only sinks him further, until he is found prostrate on Esther's couch hand that seals his fate. The intervention of Harbonah adds a providential detail. A simple eunuch remembers the gallows prepared for Mordecai. And that word becomes the final sentence. God uses secondary, seemingly insignificant voices to bring justice at the appointed time. The execution of Haman on his own gallows is the culmination of divine justice. The wicked falls into his own trap, and the righteous is vindicated. What seemed impossible, condemned Jew, and a powerful enemy is reversed in a single day. Thus acts the God who reigns over kings, decrees, and nations. Key lessons: God places His children in strategic positions, not for their comfort, but to fulfill His purpose. Prayer and fasting prepare the ground for moments of courage. The enemy will always be exposed and will fall into his own traps. Even the smallest details, Harbunah's words, the records in the Chronicles are used by God to accomplish His plan. Divine justice brings peace. The king's wrath was appeased because order was restored. This chapter challenges us to see our circumstances not as coincidence, but as part of a greater plan. You may be in an uncomfortable place or situation, but God can use you there to bring change in the lives of others. Perhaps you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. The story of Esther 7 is not just a historical account, it is a mirror where every believer can see their own calling. Just as Esther was positioned in the palace for a greater purpose, we too have been placed in specific places, families, jobs, and contexts, but because God has prepared us for this time. Esther did not speak at the first banquet. She waited for the second. She knew how to remain silent until the precise moment. This reminds us that not every battle is fought immediately. Some require patience, prayer, and preparation. Learning to wait for Kairos God's appointed time is just as important as having the courage to act. When Esther finally spoke, she did not do it for herself alone, but for her people. Her plea was intercession. In our lives, God calls us to use our voice not only for our needs, but to intercede for others, for our family, our nation, our church. Perhaps your prayer today is sustaining someone who doesn't even know it. Haman seemed invincible, but he fell in a single day. Esther didn't have to fight with human weapons or schemes. She simply stood firm in the grace of God. This shows us that true victory is not found in our strategies, but in the justice of the Lord that works at the perfect moment. Perhaps today you are in a difficult job, a divided family, or an environment hostile to your faith. You might think it's all coincidence, but God may be using you as light in that darkness. Maybe you are there to be the voice of hope, the bridge of reconciliation, or the instrument of salvation. The question that echoed in Esther's life is still relevant today. And who knows if for such a time as this you have come to the kingdom. God does not place us in positions without purpose. Esther risked her life and became an instrument of deliverance. We too can be used if we choose to live with humility, courage, and faith. Thus, the message of chapter 7 transcends the centuries. The justice of God will be revealed. The enemy will be defeated, and those who remain firm in the Lord will see that every detail of their lives was aligned with an eternal plan. You are not where you are by accident. You are there because God has sent you for this time. If you want to grow in your knowledge of God's Word and go deeper in your biblical studies, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Here, you will find deep reflections, detailed Bible studies, and teachings to strengthen your faith. Don't forget to click the bell so you don't miss any content. And if this message has been a blessing to you, share it with others so they too can grow spiritually. Join our community and continue moving forward in your walk with God.